There are some books out there that are clearly made by bookworms, about bookworms, for bookworms. Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler comes to mind. So does Bohumil Harabal's Too Loud a Solitude. But now there's Carlos Maria Domínguez in The House of Paper, translated by Nick Caistor and illustrated by Peter Siss. This is yet another new to me Argentine or Argentinian. Should I say Argentine or Argentinian? I've seen it used both ways, and I think I used Argentine once on a call with someone at work who was down in Buenos Aires, and she kind of chuckled and said that it sounded cute coming from me. I don't know if that just means because of my accent or because that's like an antiquated way of saying someone from Argentina, so looking for your help on that. Yet another new to me Argentine, just like earlier this year with The Novices of Lerna by Angel Bonamini. I mean, they're just cropping up at such a fast clip, these Argentinians with a clear love for books and a knack for using that to fuel great writing. Carlos Maria Domínguez then continues this trend of Latin American and Portuguese and Spanish writing, whose work embodies a reverence for books as sacred, metaphysical objects that are extensions of ourselves. The House of Paper celebrates, partly what it does, is celebrates bibliomania in all of its manifestations. It's a treasury of bookish quirks and eccentricities, from the neurotic classification and organization of our shelves to that hunt for rare and out-of-print editions, to, of course, the voracious reading of texts, the act of reading that is so time-consuming but so appealing that it vies with all of our other responsibilities in life. We also get the good old-fashioned pastime of book sniffing. Oh, and there's a glimpse of someone literally wining and dining their copy of Don Quixote, which I will neither confirm nor deny I have ever done. And there's this wonderful paragraph that I haven't encountered elsewhere in reading before. Not that does clearly does not mean that it's not out there, but this is the first time I've encountered someone talking about what I've always called book rivers or prose rivers. A similar thing occurs with books because a printed page is also a complicated drawing. It's a play of lines and tiny figures that flows from vowel to consonant, obeying its own laws of rhythm and composition, all based on the type size, the chosen font, the depth of the margins, the thickness of the paper, folios on the right or in the center, the infinite tiny details that go to create a beautiful object. However new the edition may be, and however white the paper, candlelight lends a book an extra luster that brings out values and subtleties in a magical way, and the pathways become a delight. What pathways, I asked, unsure I had heard him right. Well, that's an age-old discussion. Nobody can really be sure whether it's the author's genius or the skill of the printer. Opinions are divided, but for many readers, it's enough for them to look at the pathways to know whether a book is good and should be read. And he talks about how those pathways are, as a friend described to me, sometimes he gets distracted by seeing the blank spaces, the kerning between letters, but also the real spacing between words and the way things are laid out on a page. His eyes tend to follow these rivers, these tributaries that go through the text or run through the text. I recently had the privilege of being a guest on the Unburied Books podcast, and during that time, Kasia and Dylan and I were talking about how great obsession is for literature. And The House of Paper is written as if Carlos Maria Domínguez thought, if obsession makes for great literature, what happens when the obsession is literature. The plot models itself on the tried and true convention of the mystery. A British scholar is struck and killed by a car as she's crossing the street with her nose buried in a newly purchased copy of Emily Dickinson's poetry. Thereafter, a university colleague, our narrator, takes over for her at the university there in Cambridge, and over the course of time receives a package on her behalf. Inside is a copy of Joseph Conrad's novel, The Shadow Line, but curiously encased or encrusted in concrete. This strange parcel then sparks a literature-saturated excursion or investigation into these peculiarities that stretches from Mexico and Buenos Aires to Cambridge to Uruguay. And what unfolds is an investigation into the nature of obsession and that concomitant temptation to discover the limits of our passion. I complain about having so little time to read, but just imagine a man who has all day and, if he feels like, the night too, and money to buy every book he wants. There are then no limits. He is at the mercy of his passion. And what is it that passion most wants? If you'll allow me an observation, it wants to discover its limit. Now, this was, I think, the best moment in the book. It really got me thinking about, on the one hand, what would happen if all of my obstacles were removed? All of my obstacles that keep me from just reading around the clock. But it also, on the flip side, made me once again consider that having constraints in our lives can be a good thing. And so in this way, this idea, this investigation into the nature of obsession, and then if we abandon ourselves to passion, armed with only passion and no restraints, passion most wants to discover its limits and sort of carry us along with it in its wake. But this links it to the Conrad novel, The Shadow Line. The shadow line of his novel becomes the shadow line of this character's literary obsession. And once again, as I said with the Mandarin, as I said with the Novices of Lerna, with so much other Spanish and Portuguese language fiction, Latin American Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, so on, there's this mix of lightness, airiness, humor, whimsy, charm, whatever you want to call it, in the midst of these huge questions in life and such heaviness. And there's just that irony that's captured so well in so much Latin American fiction. The book really hooks the reader right away, and it dares you to try not to read it in one sitting, which took me a couple of hours. One day in the spring of 1998, Bluma Lennon bought a secondhand copy of Emily Dickinson's poems in a bookshop in Soho. And as she reached the second poem on the first street corner, she was knocked down by a car. Books change people's destinies. Some have read The Tiger of Malaysia and become professors of literature in remote universities. Demian converted tens of thousands of young men to Eastern philosophy. Hemingway made sportsmen of them. Alexandre Dumas complicated the lives of thousands of women, quite a few of whom were saved from suicide by cookbooks. Bluma was their victim. But not the only one. An elderly professor of classical languages, Leonard Wood, was left paralyzed after being struck on the head by 5 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica that fell from a shelf in his library. My friend Richard broke a leg when he tried to reach William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom, which was so awkwardly placed he fell off his stepladder. Another of my friends in Buenos Aires caught TB in the basement of a public archive. And I even knew a dog from Chile that died of indigestion from swallowing the pages of the brothers Karamazov one afternoon when rage got the better of him. Whenever my grandmother saw me reading in bed, she would say, "Stop that, books are dangerous." For many years, I thought she was simply ignorant, but the passage of time has shown just how sensible my German grandmother was. As you would expect then, in a book of this nature, it is literally packed to the gills with Well, books, titles, and authors. I tried to jot down a list of every single one of them, but inevitably some slipped through. So here's an incomplete list. Emily Dickinson, The Tiger of Malaysia, Demian, Hemingway, Dumas, Encyclopedia Britannica, Absalom, The Brothers Karamazov, The Shadow Line, 100 Years of Solitude, Irish Fairy Tales, William Butler Yeats, Marquis de Sade, Borges, Bioy Casares, The Call of the Wild, Zorba the Greek, The 25th Hour, Piglia, Sayre, Vidal, Martin Fierro, Arlt, Vallejo, Onetti, The Summa Artis, Lope de Vega, Garcia Lorca, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Martin Amis, Julian Barnes, Vargas Llosa, Pedro Paramo, Rayuela, I can't say that very well, but it's hopscotch, Tolstoy, Hegel, Hugo, Benedetti, Don Quixote, Goethe, Baudelaire, Eugénie Grandet, which I'm actually reading right now. Pretty bizarre that showed up in here. Book in the early Balzac human comedy cycle. Spinoza, Virgil, Camus, Aristotle, Neruda, Lawrence, Eliot, and, well, I just said it, Balzac. To sum up, this book also added some aphorisms to my commonplace book that is reserved for bookish material. We lay our books out for inspection like a huge exposed brain, offering miserable excuses and feigned modesty. To build up a library is to create a life. It's never just a random collection of books. And finally, books are witnesses to a moment in our lives we will never see again. While they are still there, it is part of us. I have noticed that many people make a note of the day, month, and year that they read a book. They build up a secret calendar. And this immediately recalled to mind Proust in his Days of Reading, when he said that books are the only calendars we have of the days we have lost. And I talk about that in one of my early videos in the Why We Read Fiction series. In the end, The House of Paper immediately adds itself as one of my favorite short books of all time. And like I said, it is guaranteed to delight and reward the hopeless bookworm.